So let's go through some of these, and the class slides also contain more information in the notes if you want to review them further. So personal bias reduction strategies, number one includes awareness. You can't tackle an issue if you don't know how big the issue is or if it's even an issue, right? So this is the implicit association test. I want to forewarn you that yes, this is the assignment. I want you to be able to consolidate what you've learned in this module with the implicit association test when you answer the questions related to the assignment. But just understand that, it's could be triggering because, we don't want to be racist or whatever, but remember that this is unconscious, below the level of consciousness. Automatic associations that were created a long time ago have nothing to do with your explicit beliefs or how good of a person you are. Stereotype replacement. So this is actually like identifying those stereotypes and then replacing them, right? And so then you're kind of engaging in fear extinction, or like desensitization, I guess. And you are replacing them with something else and making other schemas and connections in your brain. Counter stereotypic imaging is something that, is definitely relevant both to ourselves, but then also, to the media and how we portray people. Perspective taking and individuating is basically humanizing people. And then increasing exposures and opportunities for positive interactions. The two strategies that do not work, and if you include these strategies in your answers to your homework assignment, I'm going to understand and I'm going to realize and be able to recognize that you did not review this video or this module section, but two strategies that don't work are stereotype suppression and too strong a belief in one's personal objectivity. So if you, say that that's how you're going to decrease implicit bias, I know for a fact you don't understand the concept because those actually increase your implicit bias. So let's talk about individuating and some of the studies related to this. Now, you don't necessarily have to watch the rest of this video, but it's, cool experiments that actually teach us what we can actually do about this. So, so in this study, people were given one of those moral ethical dilemmas, right? You can save this amount of people, but you have to sacrifice this one person. Usually in those dilemmas, people sacrifice the person because they take this utilitarian stance. And, that's very relevant now, right? People are sacrificial and their lives are worth a little bit less. It's easy to say that for some people. Now, the same people who were, willing to sacrifice them, if instead researchers first very much humanized the person, like individuate, like they got to know them, they were primed with a lot of like information and like created as human, then humans were actually more uncomfortable making this decision and actually chose less utilitarian, like they were less likely to sacrifice that one for the rest. And so this is also a strategy that's used in reverse, right? Like people, politicians, they dehumanize people because then we don't really have an emotional reaction whenever we treat them poorly. The language that we use, like saying illegal, excuses like human rights abuse because like then we have no empathy towards them. But we can, knowing these strategies can help us, one, recognize and resist when other people are trying to dehumanize, but also counteract some of that with like humanization and really try to promote change and action. Counter stereotypic imaging. So this is my daughter, Eleanor. Okay, this is not, and her clothing is not the counter stereotypic imaging that I'm talking about. So we got some new toys and this was not staged. This is how she like was playing with him. And, I thought that was really sweet, right? Like, and her and her brother walked grandma up the fire, ladder to save the person in her walker. And that's kind of beautiful that, it counters some of the stereotypes about disabilities, about elderly, about women, all in one. Intergroup trust building. So this was an interesting study. It's a little bit hard to explain, so it's in the notes if this doesn't make sense, but basically, you know how we group thems, but individuate us, right? So what happens when there's been some like mistrust because of something that's happened in the past between two groups? There was a research study that showed that if a person from the group that did the transgression actually showed remorse, and if the outgroup that was like transgressed, believed that they were like, really remorseful and wanted to make different decisions, that actually increased trust between the groups and increased more fair allocation of resources. And so there was like a computer simulated game where the groups had to decide how many tickets they would give to the other person or how much they would share. And it was a pretty interesting thing. So if you're interested in understanding how exactly they figured this out, you can read the notes. But even if it's not the person who, did the original sin or whatever, because that's what we're kind of hearing a lot now, right? Like, it wasn't my generation that had slaves. Well, because we group those groups together, like out groups or in groups or whatever, even just hearing someone who is associated with the same social group be remorseful and impacted by that actually rebuilds trust in relationships. So thoughts and prayers, this is something we hear a lot, right? Like, it's a thing. So what inspires thoughts and prayers, and what can we do about it, right? Because why are we willing to give money and change policy and motivate and like engage in collective action for some things, right? But not for other things, even if the other things are really bad. We just kind of tweet a thoughts and prayers thing. Well, there's a couple of different ways that you can motivate action. And recognizing one way is through sympathy, right? So, we feel this sympathy or empathy because we identify with the people who are needing our help. And we see that especially in the United States when we will like donate so much money to like a small disaster, but some other disaster happens on the other side of the world, and like we thoughts and prayer it. So realizing that we're not always going to have that sympathetic pool, like not everyone is going to have that identification with thems, right? Because of so many things. And so we're not always going to be able to use that to motivate action. So we need a different framework. And so another way that people are motivated to act without having to identify with the group that needs help is through actually using like ethics and values and morals. And so this is really about like, oh, this is not like us, like this is what one characteristic of our in-group is that we value justice, and we value giving people a chance and opportunity. We value life, whatever kind of moral or ethical framework someone else is using, we can use that instead to trigger and motivate action. And then, of course, the increased positive intergroup interactions, but the effect of this is actually going to also depend on like the social hierarchy and where those groups stand. Now, let's talk about how to be a bigot and how to make things worse. Remember, stereotype suppression, too strong a belief in one's objectivity doesn't work. Also, cognitive stressors really negatively impact our ability to challenge our own implicit bias. Like it actually increases our implicit bias. It increases our assumptions. It increases our emotional reactivity to other people based on our, negative or like inaccurate assumptions about how they're responding to us based on like, the tone of their voice or their like facial expression or whatever. Like we overreact in often in negative ways. And so this has been shown when like physicians who have a particularly stressful shift in the ER, increase their pro-white implicit bias. Now, how can we deal with this? One, we can take care of ourselves, right? So sometimes taking care of others means putting your oxygen mask on first too. Like you have to sleep and take care of yourself. Now that doesn't mean take care of yourself in terms of like hoard all the money and resources. It just means like check in with yourself. If you're like grumpy and stressed or whatever, you're going to treat other people like crap, especially if they're others, right? And then this also has implications on maybe like hiring more physicians or restructuring the hours in which we work, or creating an environment where we don't get so stressed out and treat patients horribly. Recognizing that scapegoating and displacement aggression work. They're very effective. And so, we always in times of stress want to blame someone or want to, on a like household level, like kicking the dog or whatever is a thing related to displacement aggression. So whenever people are in like domestic violence, like probation or whatever, one of the things that they have to do is keep a job, because we know that unemployment increases domestic violence, because like you have this displacement aggression. And as long as you can have that outlet for frustration, which is like harming and violence towards another person, it really, really helps our stress level. And so we have to be sure that this is not one of the things that we use, because of course it harms, it kills. And during pandemics, it's very stressful, it's very scary, and we always want to blame immigrants. We always want to blame them and scapegoat. And so really, we need to not do this. This makes it worse. Panic-induced bias. So this is very relevant to the pandemic. This is very relevant to our economic system, because if you set the stage for scarcity, if you convince someone that we're in a state of scarcity and we need to ration things, they are going to view outgroup members in a way that facilitates harmful behavior, like hoarding resources. And one of the cultural components of a white supremacy society, if you go back and review those cultural characteristics, is creating a sense of scarcity, right? But we do not have a sense of scarcity in the United States. We have an abundance of resources. And so how does behavior and how does perception change whenever you operate from that value? Because there's planning and then there's like creating chaos. And so, even at the very beginning of this pandemic, people were getting ready to ration resources and talking about rationing resources. And of course, we exacerbated racial inequities in this country because of that. Because when people are fearing that their survival depends, then they're going to only like worry about us's, right? Like that's like a biologically embedded thing. And they're going to excuse and rationalize, treating them harmfully. Here is one. It's not necessarily stereotype suppression, but it's kind of related. This is something real. I don't know how it concluded, but this was a hospital who was going to, host a diversity panel. And if we look close, majority minority means perspective of inclusion. Okay, cool. Not to say that, everyone's voice isn't like valuable and we need input from all the places, but when we're talking about diversity and exclusion and minority, we're not talking about numbers necessarily, we're talking because people of color are not the minority in the world, right? We're talking about like rationing of power. And if assume that you already know everything, that you don't really have stereotypes, that like you're just not going to see all of those power imbalances and classes and like reality, then you're going to make stupid mistakes like this, like publicizing a diversity talk. And so the interesting part is that they missed 79% of women at this institution, 21% of men. Okay, sure, you're in the like numerical minority. What's that like? Look at the titles of the panelists, the male panelists. Why would all of the managerial senior positions be held by men in a minority? Because they have the majority power, right? Like totally ridiculous. And too strong a belief in one's personal objectivity or denial. Oh, this is so incredibly embarrassing. So this was a post from the Journal of American Medical Association, very prominent journal, and a couple of the editors who, were pretty big deals. And so the tweet, no physician is racist, so how can there be structural racism in healthcare? And note the date, which was this month, and ridiculous. And so basically what they did was argue that because the term racism is so triggering for white people, we shouldn't talk about it like that anymore. And so basically, don't talk about racism, just upholds like a white supremacist system. We also can't be colorblind, right? Because equal treatment exacerbates inequities because we're not all starting from an equal spot. So equity or equitable access, equitable interventions don't mean equality. It doesn't mean that, okay, let's just give everyone the same thing, because everyone doesn't need the same thing. Kind of like what you saw with the resiliency activity, the little animated game. You have to really consider what people need and meet them where they're at. And that might be diverting more resources to the people who have been structurally, systemically, institutionally, historically oppressed and marginalized. And so one way that this has been showing up is really in the algorithms in tech, in health tech. And so I think this might have even been Kaiser, but one of the health systems created this algorithm that didn't even use race as a component. So race wasn't even in the algorithm, totally colorblind, right? And it was designed to help identify the patients who needed a higher level of care, like help, like case management, social support, whatever, just to manage their more complex illness. So the way that they determined who has a complex illness was by the healthcare utilization and the cost incurred by the person. So obviously, if they were more expensive, if they were coming to the doctor more often, that meant that they probably had a more complex condition and they need more intensive case management and resources and, a diversion of that. And so I think the goal and the intention was equity. And guess what? We're just going to make it, colorblind. We're not even going to put race into the equation. But it turns out that this was actually exacerbating inequities because it was diverting all of those resources to healthier white patients and away from, the more complex Black patients who really needed it. And the reason was because there's much more that goes into like utilization and expense than just sickness. Because if you have paid time off, of course you can go to the doctor more. Or if you're worried about every little thing and, able to access, the medicines or whatever, like that, there might be a racial bias to that. And so because the data that was being analyzed was already biased, you can't just put a non-biased algorithm in it. That doesn't, you have to adjust for that. So it doesn't work. And so, people who are interested in health tech, like this is a hot topic. And it turns out that, like, you know, luckily, whenever somebody brought this up and pointed this out, the EMR did not just deny it and shut it down and suppress it. They actually went back in and it fixed it. And whenever they did that, well, whenever they were analyzing it, like the percentage of Black patients who should have been enrolled in this program jumped from 17% to like almost 50%. That's a huge amount of patients that were lost, you know, due to this like colorblind situation. So if anyone is interested in this, like there is, you know, Coded Gaze. I can't remember, Artificial Justice League or something. And they are working on how there is bias and, you know, oppression within tech, health tech specifically. For researchers, we need to really like focus on racism, not race. It just, you know, reinforces the bias too much if you don't explicitly state it. And even when you do, it doesn't necessarily always work, but we need to start saying what we mean, because if not, it just reinforces the schemas we already assume. And so, you know, these are two good quotes to remember. The only thing that should come after "I'm not racist, but racism is so ingrained in my society and culture that on some level, I definitely am. I need to do my part to destroy the system of oppression that people like me have created and benefit from on the daily." And then the other is really talking to, you know, this kind of white supremacist value of perfectionism, right? And of course, some of you guys know how that feels and the anxiety from messing up, right? But you're going to mess up. That's okay. Hopefully you don't peak in college. And the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. That's actually like contradictory, right? Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And that's the only way forward. So hopefully that helps explain some more complex concepts, and hopefully you learned the biological basis of all of this.